So, huge spoilers for all 6 episodes of The Ones Who Live in this video. And it's very possible that this is the last Ones Who Live video on this channel, potentially the last Walking Dead video in general for a while. Not sure yet if I'll cover Daryl Dixon on the channel, but I still do want to do some like Walking Dead rankings, a video discussing the future of the franchise, potentially some retrospectives on the early seasons, since they're still, in my opinion, some of the best television ever made. But if any of these videos sound interesting to you, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of them. And also, if you're interested in my reviews for all 6 episodes, I'm going to link a playlist in the description so you can check them all out. But The Ones Who Live was one of the most anticipated TV shows for me, I think maybe ever, because Rick Grimes is in my top 5 characters from any TV show, any movie, and just knowing he was coming back in some form was so exciting. So I was hyped as hell when this was still a trilogy of movies, but it got kind of worrying for a while when we were getting absolutely no updates, and for a while it definitely felt like it was pretty likely that these movies would just end up in development hell and get cancelled eventually. When it got announced at Comic-Con 2022 that the project was still happening, but would now be a show that also brings in Michonne, I could not have been happier. To me, when it comes to characters, you just can't tell stories in a better medium than television. I think television really gives you freedom to do a lot of things that a movie might limit you with, especially because of their runtime. But like, thinking about the show as a whole, I was genuinely very happy with a lot of it. The 4th episode was an amazing standout and to me felt on par with some of the best episodes of the original show, like set almost entirely in one location, focused on just the dialogue and the acting between Rick and Michonne, with both Andrew and Denai giving career-defining performances. And I think that's always what the main show did best, was the acting coupled with the character moments. Like, action was always a big part of the main show, but to me it was never as interesting as really delving into the mindset of these characters, like seeing how the world was changing who Rick was, for example, really exploring his darker moments where he's losing his humanity. This was always the greatest thing about the original show, and not like, you know, season 8 being 16 episodes of non-stop gunfights, which season 8 is my least favorite season of the main show for that very reason. And for the first 4 episodes of The Ones Who Live, the show felt to me like it was digging into these characters in a very real and serious way. There were fight scenes, there was action, but it was about the characters and exploring all of them in such a nuanced and well-written way, not just with Rick and Michonne, but also in the snippets we were getting of characters like Beale, Thorne, and Okafor. I was really into what they were doing, to the point where I was starting to ask myself, if when all this is said and done, would I put this season on par with the golden years of the main show? Now, getting kind of negative for a few minutes, unfortunately, I felt like the show really started to buckle and fall apart in its final 2 episodes. And a major reason being that this felt like a 10-episode story to me being rushed so that it could be told in 6 episodes, because for some reason the Walking Dead universe is incapable of having a first season not be 6 episodes, even when that is directly damaging to the pacing and the story they're trying to tell. But I mean, even going past the rushed aspect, I felt like episodes 5 and 6 were far more in line with seasons of the main show that I disliked. If I would compare the first 4 episodes to the first 5 seasons of the main show, I would compare episodes 5 and 6 to something more like seasons 7 and 8 of the main show. And by this I mean that the show became more about the action and rushing to a finish line that didn't make sense to be at yet. Then the characters, the show desperately wanted Beale and the CRM to be done with, so we do away with all the interesting character moments and intrigue so that Beale and the CRM can both get a 15-minute action scene to get rid of them. Similarly, episode 5 was almost entirely a chase scene between Rick, Michonne, and Judith, where every second scene had characters holding guns to each other's heads, but no one ever actually gets shot. Well, almost no one. But this was a major issue I had in the main show. Eventually, it felt like all sense of tension and the weight of a scene would lose impact, because we'd always see Rick or someone else be put in a gunpoint situation that they very obviously would get out of. And it always felt a bit lazy to me. You can be more creative in finding ways to tell the story you want to tell that doesn't boil down to Jadis points gun at Rick, Jadis talks until Rick can get out of said situation. Like, maybe, in my opinion, you could write a reason why Jadis doesn't need to point a gun at Rick all the time. That way, when she actually does point a gun at him, you're more worried that she might actually pull the trigger and shoot him because you don't see her point the gun very often. But it wasn't just that these final 2 episodes took more of an action turn. I also kind of felt like the dialogue fell off a bit of a cliff after episode 4. In the 4th episode, we have what feels like really realistic, natural dialogue. It feels like legitimate arguments and conversations between Rick and Michonne. But then episode 5 and 6 sort of fell into this weird area that the main show also did after a certain point, when you have characters repeating lines or saying things kind of just to say them. One thing was like when Michonne said in the 6th episode that we do this because we can do this. And it's those little lines that very briefly take me out of the show because I just don't think it works in really any context. But even in the final 2 episodes, the dialogue still had moments that really worked. It was just great with the whole back and forth between Beale and Rick about the echelon briefing before Rick decides to fight Beale. Like, that was all really, really intense. I think it's because there weren't overly obvious guns pointed or anything. It was just two great actors talking, and while both have slightly different motives, the scene still feels so intense because you truly have no idea how it's going to play out, how either is going to react to each other, or what is going to happen next. But the handling of Beale in general might be my biggest complaint with the show. And I've seen a lot of people online after the episode defending why they did what they did, saying there's no reason to be annoyed over the handling of Beale in the CRM because 1, Rick and Michonne are what the show is about, and 2, the CRM and Beale were never meant to be anything more than they were. I completely agree with the first point. This show was always centered around Rick and Michonne. Of course that's the case. They always said that this show was a love story at the front and center. But that doesn't mean the show gets a pass for making anything that wasn't Rick and Michonne get wrapped up in such an underwhelming way. You can't just concentrate on one core aspect of the show if that means everything else surrounding that aspect is done poorly. You need to make your show balanced, make it so that even though there's one thing that's clearly the forefront and the main point of the show, everything in the show should still be done in somewhat of a satisfying and well-written way. I can point to a dozen different shows where a side plot is not meant to be nearly as important as the main plot, but the show still wraps up that side plot in a satisfying way because that's what good writers do. Deliberately making Beale end in the show in such a quick way, out of nowhere, doesn't really hammer the point home that the show is Rick and Michonne's story. It hammers the point home that the writers were focused on one aspect of the story and didn't want to put effort into other aspects, which, if that was the case, the CRM shouldn't have been in this story at all. You could make an incredibly satisfying and well-written Rick and Michonne story that doesn't need to devalue a group and villain that the franchise has been setting up and establishing for half a decade at this point. For the second point, that point being that Beale and the CRM were never meant to be anything more, I could not disagree more with that. I think having them randomly be teased for years in The Walking Dead, having an entire 2-season spin-off show based around them, having that spin-off show end with a credit scene that sets up the franchise's future, and also going to the effort of having them appear in Fear the Walking Dead a few times is something that, okay, I'm getting a little bit annoying here for a second. I hate talking like this, but I think anyone with a sense of media literacy or storytelling direction can notice how much the CRM have been clearly being set up in other projects, and how much Beale has been mentioned in other projects. That, because of all of that, this version of the CRM was supposed to be a villainous force and a serious threat, something the franchise was heading towards. I don't think it's impossible that we see them again in some form, whether that's the spies mentioned in their communities or if something to do with investigating the variants comes back. But I think this is this iteration of the CRM that had Beale and Judith and had the kids from World Beyond super into, the version that had already destroyed Omaha and Campus Colony and were very clearly being set up as something serious, deserved far more of a wrap-up. Like, the fact that they were gone quicker and in less time of an episode than Terminus or the Reapers is just a little insane to me. And yes, even though this is Rick and Michonne's story and this is Rick and Michonne's show, and yes, they should have been prioritized over everything else, that doesn't give the show a free pass to not give anything else outside of Rick and Michonne a proper conclusion. But the show in general did feel like it didn't touch on a lot of things. I'm not going to say anything about Heath because it was never confirmed that we'd see him anywhere again, but the PPP stuff, for example, was something that the writers and producers specifically said would be addressed. And I'm sorry, but a tiny bit of writing on the wall in the background isn't that. We had a whole cast of World Beyond vowing to take down the CRM at the end of their show, as well as the reveal about Beale's son, and some other characters scattered around, and nothing to do with any of them was addressed here, which, like, quality or viewership of World Beyond aside, don't start a story if you've no intention of finishing it, because you're kind of just ensuring that the rewatchability of World Beyond is almost non-existent. Like, since nothing to do with World Beyond was really addressed here, that kind of does not give anybody a reason to go back and watch World Beyond. And like, again, I think a Rick and Michonne devoted wrap-up show was needed. I would have been really happy if their show was its own separate thing away from the CRM. But this show had so many plot threads established in other parts of the franchise that were never addressed that I do just think that there was a lot of wasted potential here that could have and should have maybe been 10 episodes. But I did love a lot of the show still. Like, I can't dispute how fantastic those first 4 episodes were. Like, I think almost everything involving Rick and Michonne in this show was borderline perfect. The ending with them getting back to Judith and RJ was the only ending I wanted for their characters, and I absolutely loved the parallels that the duo went through in the early parts of the show. Seeing Rick and Michonne separately going through similar stuff when rising through the ranks, seeing Michonne out on her own with Nat and the gang, and how that was similar in mindset and mentality to what Rick was dealing with inside the CRM. Like, all of this stuff was so good and so tonally detached from a lot of what episode 5 and 6 ultimately ended up being. In terms of a second season, nothing's confirmed, and the interviews between Gimple and Denai and Andrew have been very much non-answers where they're not saying no, but they're not saying yes either. My take on the matter for that is, for the moment, Denai and Andrew are done, but we will probably see them again someday. This show was extremely popular and successful for AMC. It's been all over the internet in a way well beyond Fear the Walking Dead, and then even Dead City and Daryl Dixon couldn't reach. Maybe it's just the circles I'm in online, but as someone who has watched all these spin-offs as they've come out, I feel like things like my Twitter and even my friend group have been talking about The Ones Who Live more than anything in the Walking Dead franchise outside of like the original show. And I think AMC isn't going to want to lose that. They're going to do everything they can to try and keep the duo back on board for cameos or some kind of follow-up to this. The whole humanity only has 14 years left thing is probably attached to the variants, so whenever that's addressed, or if it's addressed, with how certain stuff was handled here, I've lost faith in The Walking Dead's ability to follow up on storylines. But if that is addressed, I think it's something that they will probably require Rick and Michonne to come back for, or to come out of retirement or something like that. But I'm also not against the idea that they don't. I think this was a really good wrap-up and end to both their characters, and if we just assume they're living happily as a family while we watch Carol, Daryl, Maggie or Negan on their adventures, I'm okay with that. It feels like this slight tension or weight has been lifted knowing that when we're watching the next Walking Dead project with the knowledge that Rick and Michonne are back with their kids, like, it's just nice, it's kind of wholesome. I do wish this overall review wasn't as negative as it was. I think my final thoughts are that over half the show is still really, really good. If the absolute only thing you wanted out of this show was Rick and Michonne's ending, then you're probably going to be pretty satisfied. But if you were hoping that the overall story for the franchise that has been being set up for years is dealt with in an interesting way, then the show might not be what you wanted. But look, I did like a lot of it for the most part. Andrew and I played Rick and Michonne to absolute perfection. If we never see them again, I'm happy we got this. Now on to Daryl Dixon, let's see what happens there. I'm excited for season 2 of that. I think it looks pretty interesting. I also just think the architecture and the way that they're showing like rural France looks really cool. It reminds me of rural areas in Europe. Like a lot of the countryside parts of Ireland, especially the area where I grew up in, looks a lot like some of the places that are in the Daryl Dixon trailer, which I think is really cool. But how did you feel about The Walking Dead, The Ones Who Live? Did you like it? Did you hate it? And if you enjoyed this video, maybe consider subscribing and liking and sharing it to someone who you think might enjoy it. And thank you so much for watching. This is kind of the first sort of time I've been doing proper Walking Dead videos. I think I made a review for season 10 back when that first came out, but this is the first time I kind of was weekly doing Walking Dead stuff, and it was honestly pretty great. Like I really enjoyed sort of hearing from the Walking Dead fandom because I've never really been too involved in it, so it was cool to see all of that. And in general, you guys have been awesome. So thank you so much for watching and have an amazing day.